The Arizona desert stretched endlessly under the merciless August sun, its red sand and scattered sagebrush creating a landscape that seemed to swallow hope itself. Highway 191 cut through this desolation like a scar, connecting the small mining town of Copper Ridge to the outside world, though few bothered to make the journey anymore. 15 years ago, the Torres family had driven this same route, heading to their annual camping trip at Canyon de Chelly. Elena Torres, a third-grade teacher with gentle eyes and calloused hands from her weekend pottery hobby, had packed enough supplies for a week. Her husband David, a mechanic who could fix anything with an engine, had checked their blue 1995 Chevy Suburban 3 times before loading the camping gear. 8-year-old Sophia had clutched her favorite stuffed rabbit, chattering excitedly about roasting marshmallows and seeing the ancient cliff dwellings. They never came home. Michael Torres pulled his dusty pickup truck to the side of the highway, his hands trembling as he stared at the sun-bleached metal protruding from a wash 30 yards away. At 28, he carried the weight of those lost years in the lines around his eyes and the way his shoulders never quite straightened. He'd been 13 when his family disappeared, staying behind with his grandmother because of a broken leg from a skateboarding accident. That broken leg had saved his life and cursed him to spend the next decade and a half wondering what had happened to the people he loved most. The morning had started like any other. Michael worked construction now, following in his father's footsteps, of working with his hands, though he fixed buildings instead of engines. He'd been driving to a job site in Flagstaff when he'd spotted something that made his heart stop. There, partially buried in the sandy arroyo beside the highway, was the distinctive blue paint and chrome bumper of a mid-90s Suburban. Michael climbed out of his truck, his work boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. The desert heat hit him like a physical force, but he barely noticed. He dreamed about this moment for 15 years, imagined finding some trace of his family, some answer to the questions that had eaten away at him like acid. The search had officially ended. After 2 years, though, Michael had never stopped looking. He'd spent weekends driving back roads, checking with rangers, following up on every possible lead that came through the tip line. As he approached the vehicle, his heart hammered against his ribs. The license plate was partially visible, covered by years of blown sand and desert debris. With shaking hands, he brushed away the accumulated dirt. Arizona plates, the numbers and letters matching the ones burned into his memory from countless missing person flyers and police reports. The Suburban sat at an angle, nose first in the wash, as if it had been driven straight off the road. But that didn't make sense. His father had been the most careful driver Michael had ever known, the kind of man who checked his mirrors twice and always used his turn signals even on empty roads. The vehicle's rear end pointed toward the highway, easily visible to anyone who looked, yet somehow it had remained hidden for 15 years. Michael pulled out his cell phone, surprised to see he had signal out here. His hands shook as he dialed the number he'd memorized long ago, the direct line to Detective Ray Castellanos at the Copper Ridge Sheriff's Department. Castellanos had been the lead investigator on his family's case, a patient man with sad eyes, who'd never given up hope, even when the official search was called off. Castellanos, Detective, it's Michael Torres. I found the car. There was a long pause, filled only by the desert wind whistling through the sagebrush. Michael, where are you? Highway 191, about 12 miles south of town. It's them, Detective. It's definitely them. Don't touch anything else, I'm on my way. Michael ended the call and stood in the blazing sun, staring at the vehicle that held the answers he'd been seeking for half his life. The desert seemed to hold its breath around him, the silence broken only by the distant hum of an approaching 18-wheeler. As the truck passed, its driver never glanced toward the wash where the Torres family's final journey had ended. Part of Michael wanted to approach the Suburban, to peer through the dusty windows and see what remained inside. But Castellanos had been clear. This was a crime scene now after all these years. The desert had preserved what the world had forgotten, keeping the family's secrets buried in sand and silence until this moment. He returned to his pickup and sat in the air conditioning, watching the road for Castellanos while his mind raced with questions. Why had the car gone off the road here? Where were the bodies? and why, after 15 years of searches involving helicopters, dogs, and volunteers combing every inch of the area, had no one spotted a bright blue Suburban sitting in plain sight beside one of the region's main highways. The answers, Michael knew, were buried somewhere in that sun-baked metal tomb. And finally, after 15 years of wondering, he was going to learn the truth about what had happened to his family on that summer day when they'd driven into the desert and never returned. As he waited, Michael's thoughts drifted to his grandmother, who'd raised him after the disappearance. She'd died 3 years ago, taking her theories and her endless hope to the grave. He wished she could be here for this moment, to see that the search hadn't been in vain, that the Torres family would finally come home. Detective Ray Castellanos arrived 43 minutes later, his patrol unit kicking up a cloud of dust as it pulled behind Michael's pickup. At 56, Castellanos moved with the careful precision of a man who'd seen too much in his 30-year career, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the best investigators in northern Arizona. The Torres case had haunted him, remaining open on his desk long after other cold cases had been filed away and forgotten. "Show me," Castellanos said, stepping out of his vehicle and adjusting his wide-brimmed hat against the sun. Michael led him down into the wash, both men moving carefully on the loose sand and scattered rocks. Up close, the Suburban looked like a relic from another era, its blue paint faded to almost white in places, the chrome pitted with rust. Desert plants had grown up around it, partially concealing it from the road above, though Michael couldn't understand how dozens of search teams had missed it. "This doesn't make sense," Castellanos muttered, circling the vehicle. "We searched this area 3 times. I personally flew over this stretch of highway in a helicopter." "Maybe it wasn't here then," Michael suggested, though the words felt hollow, even as he spoke them. Castellanos knelt beside the driver's door, studying the sand patterns around the vehicle. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the undisturbed earth beneath the chassis. "This Suburban has been here for years, decade and a half easily. The way the sand has shifted, the vegetation growth patterns, this didn't arrive recently." Michael felt a chill despite the desert heat. "Then how did we miss it?" "I don't know, son, but we're going to find out." Castellanos returned to his patrol unit and radioed for backup, requesting the county coroner, a crime scene photographer, and a tow truck capable of handling the recovery. Then he opened his trunk and retrieved a pair of latex gloves, pulling them on with practiced efficiency. "Stay back," he told Michael. "I know you want answers, but we need to do this right." The detective approached the driver's side window, cupping his hands around his eyes to peer through the dusty glass. Michael watched his face carefully, looking for any reaction that might give away what he was seeing. After a long moment, Castellanos straightened and moved to the passenger side, then to the rear windows. "What is it?" Michael called. "Are they—" "The vehicle appears to be empty," Castellanos said, his voice carefully neutral. "No occupants visible, but there's significant debris inside. Looks like camping gear." Michael's heart sank. He'd hoped against hope that finding the car would mean finding his family, even if it meant finding their remains. The not knowing had been torture, but this felt almost worse. More questions without answers. Castellanos tried the driver's door handle and found it unlocked. The door opened with a metallic groan that seemed unnaturally loud in the desert silence. The smell that emerged was musty and dry, like old paper and forgotten time. He leaned inside, careful not to disturb anything, and began cataloging what he saw. "Camping supplies in the back," he reported. "Sleeping bags, cooler, what looks like a camp stove. Front seat has some personal items and a purse, wallet, set of keys." He paused, pulling out a small digital camera from behind the gear shift. "Photography equipment. This is definitely their vehicle." Michael moved closer, drawn by the mention of his mother's camera. Elena had been passionate about photography, always documenting their family trips and adventures. "Does the camera still work?" "We'll find out back at the station," Castellanos said, sealing the camera in an evidence bag. "Right now, I need to process the scene properly. Over the next 2 hours, as backup arrived and the recovery operation began, Michael found himself thinking about the camping trip that had been planned for that weekend. His family had been excited about visiting Canyon de Chelly, a place they'd camped several times before. The route was familiar, The destination, well known. Nothing about the trip should have been dangerous or unusual. The tow truck operator, a weathered man named Pete Kowalski, who'd worked every major accident on Highway 191 for the past 20 years, studied the Suburban's position with professional interest. "Doesn't look like an accident," he observed, spitting tobacco juice into the sand. "No damage to the front end, no sign of impact. Looks like someone just drove it down here and parked it." "Could you drive it out of here?" Castellanos asked. Pete walked around the vehicle, checking the tires and examining the undercarriage. "Tires are flat, but that's just time and weather. Engine's probably seized up, but the frame looks solid. Yeah, I can pull her out, but it's going to be slow going." As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, the Suburban was finally winched up onto Pete's trailer. Michael watched the recovery with mixed emotions. This was the moment he'd imagined for 15 years, but it felt anticlimactic. Instead of answers, he had more questions. Instead of closure, he had a new mystery. "What happens now?" he asked Castellanos. "Now we process everything," the detective replied. "Go through the vehicle inch by inch, examine every piece of evidence, and try to reconstruct what happened. Could take weeks, maybe months. And my family?" Castellanos looked out at the vast desert surrounding them. "If they left that vehicle here, they went somewhere. People don't just vanish into thin air, Michael. We'll find them." As the convoy headed back toward Copper Ridge, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that finding the Suburban was just the beginning. Somewhere in the desert, or in the small town he'd grown up in, the truth about his family's disappearance was waiting to be uncovered. The question was whether he was prepared for what that truth might reveal. The Copper Ridge Sheriff's Department sat on Main Street like a monument to small-town law enforcement, its adobe facade and red tile roof reflecting the area's Spanish colonial heritage. Michael had spent countless hours in this building over the years, meeting with investigators, reviewing case files, and clinging to hope that grew thinner with each passing season. Now, as he followed Detective Castellanos through the familiar hallways, he felt the weight of 15 years pressing down on him like the desert heat. The evidence room where they'd taken the Suburban's contents smelled of dust and forgotten time. Items were spread across multiple tables, each tagged and photographed. His mother's leather purse with her driver's license still inside, his father's wallet containing credit cards that had never been used after the disappearance, camping equipment that should have provided a week of family memories. "Your mother's camera," Castellanos said, holding up the digital device. "Battery's dead, obviously, but the memory card might still be intact. These old cards were pretty robust." Michael stared at the camera, remembering how his mother would always insist on taking pictures of everything. She documented every trip, every hike, every campsite, every sunset. "That could work in our favor," Castellanos replied, connecting the camera to a laptop computer. "If something went wrong on their trip, she might have captured it." The first images that appeared on the screen were painful in their normalcy. Michael saw his family as they'd been on that last morning, loading the Suburban with camping gear and supplies. His father checking the tire pressure one final time, his methodical nature evident even in the casual snapshot. His mother smiling at the camera, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing the University of Arizona t-shirt she always wore on camping trips. And Sophia, his little sister, holding her stuffed rabbit and grinning with the infectious excitement that only 8-year-olds possessed. "These were taken at your house," Castellanos observed, noting the familiar background of the Torres family's modest ranch home on Elm Street. "Mom always documented the preparation," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "She said the anticipation was part of the adventure." The images continued chronologically, showing the family's departure and their drive through Copper Ridge. Michael recognized the main street of his hometown, the familiar storefronts and desert landscape. Then came pictures from the highway, long stretches of desert and red rock formations that marked the route toward Canyon de Chelly. "Stop there," Michael said suddenly, pointing at an image that showed the Suburban's interior from the passenger seat. In the background, through the rear window, another vehicle was visible. "There's someone following them." Castellanos enhanced the image, but the vehicle remained too distant to identify clearly. It appeared to be a pickup truck, dark-colored, but the details were obscured by distance and the camera's focus on the interior of the Suburban. They continued through the images, watching the Torres family's final journey unfold in digital snapshots. There were pictures of roadside stops, including one at a gas station that Michael recognized as being about 30 miles from where they'd found the Suburban. The timestamp showed it was taken around 2:30 p.m. on the day they'd disappeared. "This is important," Castellanos said, making notes. "It gives us a timeline. They were still alive and well at 2:30, still heading toward their destination." The next several images showed the family arriving at what appeared to be their intended campsite. Michael could see Canyon de Chelly's distinctive red sandstone formations in the background, confirming they'd reached their destination safely. His parents were setting up camp, while Sophia played with her rabbit nearby. Everything looked normal, peaceful exactly as it should have been. But then the images changed. The photographs became erratic, showing odd angles and blurred motion. Instead of the careful compositions his mother was known for, these pictures seemed hurried, almost frantic. One showed the ground near their tent, another captured a section of desert scrub, and a third was nearly black, as if taken inside something. "Dark? What's happening here?" Michael asked, his stomach tightening with dread. "I don't know," Castellanos admitted, studying the chaotic images. But something definitely went wrong. The final photographs were the most disturbing. They showed what appeared to be the interior of a vehicle, different from the Suburban. The images were poorly lit and difficult to interpret, but Michael could make out what looked like his family members in the background, though their faces were obscured or turned away from the camera. "It looks like they were moved," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone took them from their campsite." "That's how I read it too," Castellanos agreed grimly. He continued scrolling through the images, but the final few were corrupted, showing only digital static and error messages. "The memory card was damaged," he explained, "probably from heat and time, but these last images might be recoverable with the right equipment. I'll send it to the state crime lab." Michael slumped in his chair, overwhelmed by what they'd discovered. The photographs proved that his family had reached their destination safely, had begun setting up camp as planned, and then something had gone catastrophically wrong. Someone had taken them, forced them into another vehicle, and somehow ended up with their Suburban abandoned in the desert. "This changes everything," Castellanos said, his voice grim. "This isn't a case of getting lost in the desert or having an accident. This is kidnapping, possibly murder." "But who would do this?" Michael asked. "My parents didn't have enemies. They were teachers and mechanics, not wealthy people who might be targeted for ransom. Sometimes the motive isn't obvious," Castellanos replied. "But one thing's clear. Whoever did this went to great lengths to make your family disappear. Abandoning their vehicle where it would eventually be found suggests either panic or a deliberate attempt to create confusion." As they prepared to leave the evidence room, Michael took one last look at the items spread across the tables, his family's final possessions, the remnants of a camping trip that had turned into a nightmare. The stuffed rabbit that Sophia had carried everywhere, now faded and dusty, his father's reading glasses still in their case, his mother's silver bracelet, a gift from his father on their 10th wedding anniversary. "We're going to find them," Castellanos said, his hand on Michael's shoulder. "These photographs are the break we've been waiting for. Someone in this area knows what happened to your family, and now we have evidence that this was a crime." Michael nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead to darker possibilities. 15 years was a long time. If his family had been taken by force, what were the chances they were still alive? And if they weren't, would he ever be able to find their remains in the vast desert that surrounded Copper Ridge? One thing was certain: the discovery of the Suburban had transformed his family's disappearance from a tragic mystery into an active criminal investigation. Someone had answers, and Michael was determined to find them, no matter how long it took or what the truth might reveal. 3 days after finding the Suburban, Michael sat in the crowded dining room of Martha's Diner on Main Street, picking at a plate of eggs and bacon he had no appetite for. The diner had been his family's favorite breakfast spot, a place where his father would order the same meal every Sunday after church, and his mother would chat with Martha Henley, the owner, about local gossip and school board politics. Now it felt like a museum of better times, filled with memories that cut like broken glass. "You doing all right, honey?" Martha asked, refilling his coffee cup with the maternal concern she'd shown him since his family's disappearance. At 63, she'd run the diner for 30 years and knew every secret in Copper Ridge, making her both the town's unofficial information broker and its most trusted confidant. "Just thinking," Michael replied, grateful for her presence. Martha had been one of the few people who'd never given up hope that his family would be found, always setting aside a table by the window for when they come home. "About that car they found," she asked, settling into the booth across from him. The breakfast rush had ended, leaving only a few regulars scattered throughout the diner. Michael nodded. The discovery had been front-page news in the Copper Ridge Gazette, though the article had been sparse on details. The whole town was buzzing with speculation, and Michael found himself the reluctant center of attention he'd spent years trying to avoid. "I always wondered about that camping trip," Martha said thoughtfully. "Your folks had been here the night before, remember? Having dinner to celebrate your dad's promotion at the garage." Michael looked up sharply. This was the first he'd heard of any dinner celebration. "Promotion? Oh yes, Bill Kowalski had made your dad the head mechanic. Your folks were so excited, talking about how the extra money would help with Sophia's dance lessons and maybe let them take that vacation to California they'd been planning." The information hit Michael like a physical blow. His family had been celebrating, looking forward to the future, making plans that would never come to fruition. But more importantly, Martha's casual mention of Bill Kowalski, Pete's father, who'd owned Kowalski's auto repair before retiring, triggered a memory. "Did they mention the camping trip?" Michael asked. "Your mother did. She was worried about the weather forecast, said there might be storms. But your dad convinced her. They'd be fine, said he'd checked the Suburban over twice and packed extra supplies." Martha paused, her weathered face creasing with concern. She also mentioned feeling like they were being watched. Watched? By who? She didn't know. Said it was probably nothing, but she'd noticed the same truck behind them a few times that week. "Your dad told her she was being paranoid, but Elena wasn't the paranoid type." Michael's heart began racing. The photograph from his mother's camera, the dark pickup truck visible through the rear window of the Suburban. Did she describe the truck? "Dark-colored," she said. "Maybe black or dark blue. Had some kind of equipment in the back, like construction, gear or tools." Before Michael could respond, the diner's bell chimed and Detective Castellanos entered, his expression grim. He spotted Michael immediately and approached their table, his boots echoing on the checkered linoleum floor. "Michael, I need to talk to you," he said, nodding respectfully to Martha. "Privately." Martha understood the dismissal and stood, patting Michael's shoulder. "You boys need anything, just holler." After she'd retreated to the kitchen, Castellanos slid into the booth across from Michael. "We got the enhanced images back from the lab," he said quietly. "The news isn't good." Michael braced himself. "What did you find?" "The final photographs on your mother's camera show 3 individuals in what appears to be the back of a pickup truck. 2 adults and 1 child, though the faces aren't clear enough for positive identification. But based on clothing and body types..." Castellanos paused, choosing his words carefully. "We believe it's your family." "Alive?" "Hard to tell. They appear to be restrained, possibly unconscious. The images were taken from inside the vehicle, suggesting your mother managed to hide the camera and activate it somehow before..." He didn't finish the sentence. "Before what?" "Before the memory card was damaged. Could have been intentional, could have been environmental factors, but the important thing is, we now have evidence of the vehicle used in the abduction." Castellanos pulled out a manila folder and opened it to reveal enhanced printouts of the final photographs. The images were still grainy and poorly lit, but Michael could make out the interior of a pickup truck bed covered by a tonneau cover or tarp. The shapes that might have been his family members were barely visible in the darkness. "The truck appears to be a mid-1990s Ford F-150, dark-colored, possibly black or navy blue," Castellanos continued. We're checking DMV records for registered owners in the area during that time period. Michael thought about Martha's revelation. Someone was following them before the camping trip. My mum noticed a dark pickup with construction equipment in the back. Castellanos made notes on his pad. That's consistent with what we're seeing. This wasn't random. Someone was targeting your family specifically. But why? What could anyone want with a mechanic, a teacher, and an 8-year-old girl? That's what we need to figure out. I want you to think back to the weeks before they disappeared. Any unusual incidents, strange phone calls, people asking questions about your family's routines or plans. Michael closed his eyes, trying to remember details from 15 years ago that had seemed unimportant at the time. His 13-year-old self had been focused on skateboarding and video games, not paying attention to adult concerns. There was something, he said slowly. A few weeks before the camping trip, someone broke into our garage. Dad thought it was just kids looking for tools to steal, but nothing was taken. Mum thought it was weird that they'd gone through Dad's work papers, but left his expensive tools untouched. What kind of work papers? Repair orders, customer information, vehicle registrations. Dad did side work at home sometimes, fixing cars for people who couldn't afford the shop rates. Castellanos leaned forward intently. Do you remember any of his customers from that time? Anyone who might have had access to information about your family's camping plans? Michael shook his head in frustration. I was 13. I didn't pay attention to Dad's customers. That's okay. We'll check his employment records from Kowalski's, see if we can reconstruct his client list from that period. Castellanos closed the folder and met Michael's eyes. I know this is hard, but we're making progress. The physical evidence from the Suburban, your mother's photographs and now witness accounts of surveillance, it's starting to paint a picture. A picture of what? Someone who knew your family's routines, someone who had access to information about their plans, and someone with the means and opportunity to make them disappear. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random encounter. This was planned. Michael felt a chill despite the diner's warmth. The idea that someone had deliberately targeted his family, had watched and waited for the right moment to strike, was more terrifying than any accidental tragedy. It meant there was a predator among them, someone who'd been living in Copper Ridge for 15 years, carrying the secret of what had happened to the Torres family. We'll find him, Castellanos said with quiet determination. Whoever did this made mistakes, left evidence, and now that we know what we're looking for, we'll find him. The Kowalski Auto Repair Shop sat on the edge of Copper Ridge's industrial district, a collection of weathered buildings and rusted equipment that spoke to decades of honest work under the Arizona sun. Michael had driven past it countless times over the years, but he'd never stopped in, unable to face the place where his father had worked during his final weeks. Now as he pulled his pickup into the gravel lot, he felt the weight of 15 years of avoidance pressing down on him. Pete Kowalski emerged from the main garage bay, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. At 54, he'd inherited his father's business and his methodical approach to automotive repair, though he lacked Bill's legendary skill with troublesome engines. The economic downturn had hit the shop hard, and Michael could see the evidence in the cracked asphalt and peeling paint on the building's exterior. Michael Torres, Pete said, extending a calloused hand. Hell of a thing, finding that Suburban after all these years. How you holding up? Getting by, Michael replied, accepting the handshake. I was hoping to ask you about my dad's work here. The weeks before they disappeared. Pete nodded thoughtfully, leading Michael into the shop's cluttered office. The walls were covered with automotive calendars, safety notices, and faded photographs of classic cars that had passed through the garage over the years. Behind the desk, Michael noticed a picture of his father receiving some kind of recognition award, his familiar smile frozen in time. Your dad was the best mechanic I ever knew, Pete said, settling behind his desk. Could diagnose problems just by listening to an engine. Pop was grooming him to take over more responsibilities, maybe even become a partner someday. Martha Henley mentioned he'd gotten a promotion. Head mechanic position, came with a raise and more customer interaction. Your dad was excited about it, said it would help with Sophia's dance classes, and maybe let your folks take that California trip they'd been planning. Michael felt the familiar ache of lost possibilities. Do you remember what he was working on in those final weeks? Any difficult customers or unusual situations? Pete leaned back in his chair, his expression growing thoughtful. Funny you should ask. There was something that bothered your dad near the end. Customer who kept bringing in the same truck, claiming it had problems that your dad couldn't find. At what kind of truck? Dark blue Ford F-150, maybe 94 or 95. Owner said it was running rough, losing power, making strange noises. But every time your dad looked at it, the truck ran perfect. Started to think the guy was playing some kind of game. Michael's pulse quickened. Do you remember the customer's name? Sure do. Carl Morrison. Lives out on Desert View Road, has a small ranch about 10 miles east of town. Strange guy, kept to himself mostly. Your dad started getting suspicious when Morrison kept asking personal questions about our employees, their schedules, family situations. The name meant nothing to Michael, but he filed it away for Detective Castellanos. What kind of questions? When folks took vacations, whether they had families, what their routines were like. Morrison claimed he was thinking about getting his own automotive training, maybe opening a competing shop, but your dad thought he was fishing for information. Pete opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder labeled with his father's handwriting. Pop kept detailed records of every job, every customer interaction. After your family disappeared, he went through Morrison's file with the police, but they never found anything concrete. Can I see it? Pete handed over the folder, and Michael flipped through repair orders dating back to early 2008. Carl Morrison had brought his truck to the shop 11 times between January and August of that year, each visit documented with meticulous detail by David Torres. The pattern Pete had described was clear. Repeated complaints about the same non-existent problems, each visit lasting longer than necessary, extensive conversations with the staff. Look at this, Michael said, pointing to a note his father had written on the final repair order. Customer asking about employee camping trips, fishing expeditions, family vacation plans. Seems inappropriate for automotive service context. Your dad was getting uncomfortable with Morrison by then, Pete confirmed. Told Pop he thought the guy was up to something, but nobody could figure out what. Michael studied the dates. Morrison's final visit had been on August 12, 2008, exactly 1 week before the Torres family had disappeared. According to his father's notes, Morrison had seemed agitated that day, asking specific questions about weekend schedules and whether any employees would be traveling soon. Did Morrison come back after my family disappeared? Never saw him again. Truck must have magically fixed itself. Pete's sarcasm was obvious. Pop drove out to his ranch a few times to check on him, but the place looked abandoned. Neighbors said Morrison had left town suddenly, didn't tell anyone where he was going. Michael felt his hands trembling as he read through his father's careful documentation. The pattern was undeniable. A suspicious customer showing unusual interest in employee personal lives, asking probing questions about family plans, and disappearing immediately after the Torres family vanished. It was the kind of evidence Detective Castellanos had been hoping to find. I need to take this to the police, Michael said, closing the folder. Course you do. Should have connected those dots years ago, but Morrison seemed harmless enough at the time. Just another customer with a cantankerous truck. Pete paused, his expression growing troubled. You know, there was one more thing. About a month after your family disappeared, I was cleaning out the service bay and found something wedged under one of the workbenches. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small evidence bag that looked like it had been handled many times over the years. Inside was a child's hair ribbon, pink with white polka dots, faded with age but still recognizable. Found this where your dad used to work. Never seen it before, and none of our other customers had young daughters. Always wondered if it might have belonged to Sophia. Michael stared at the ribbon, his throat constricting with emotion. He remembered Sophia wearing similar ribbons, his mother tying them in her dark hair before school each morning. The sight of this small forgotten remnant of his sister's childhood was almost unbearable. The police need to see this too, he managed to say. Pete nodded. I kept meaning to turn it in, but after the case went cold, it seemed like it would just end up in some evidence box, forgotten. Figured I'd hold on to it until there was reason to hope again. As Michael prepared to leave, Pete walked him to his truck, the evidence folder and hair ribbon clutched tightly in his hands. Your dad was a good man, Michael. Whatever happened to your family, they didn't deserve it. But I got a feeling you're going to find the truth now. That Morrison character, there was something off about him from the beginning. Driving back toward town, Michael's mind raced with implications. Carl Morrison had targeted his father's workplace, gathering intelligence about the Torres family's routines and plans. He disappeared immediately after the kidnapping, leaving behind an abandoned ranch and unanswered questions. The timeline, the suspicious behavior, the dark pickup truck, it all pointed to Morrison as the prime suspect in his family's disappearance. But questions remained. Why had Morrison targeted the Torres family specifically? Where had he taken them? And most importantly, were they still alive somewhere? Or had Michael just identified the man who'd murdered the people he loved most? The answers, he realized, lay somewhere on Desert View Road, at the abandoned ranch where Carl Morrison had once lived. It was time to visit the place where his family's nightmare had likely begun. Desert View Road stretched into the Arizona wasteland, like a scar across the landscape, its cracked asphalt disappearing into heat shimmer and endless scrubland. Michael drove slowly, checking mailbox numbers against the address he'd found in Morrison's customer file at Kowalski's Auto Repair. Detective Castellanos had insisted on accompanying him, the two men riding in the detective's patrol unit while the late afternoon sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "That's it," Castellanos said, pointing to a weathered mailbox marked with the number 4847. The name Morrison was barely visible, faded letters on a sun-bleached background that spoke of years of neglect. The property sat on 23 acres of desert scrub. According to county records Castellanos had pulled that morning, a dirt driveway wound through scattered mesquite and palo verde trees toward a cluster of buildings that had seen better days. The main house was a modest ranch-style structure with a red tile roof, its stucco walls showing cracks and water damage. Several outbuildings dotted the property, including what appeared to be a large workshop or garage. "Place has been abandoned for years," Castellanos observed as they pulled up to the house. County records show the property went into foreclosure in 2009, about a year after your family disappeared. Bank's been trying to sell it ever since. Michael stepped out of the patrol car and immediately noticed the silence. Desert properties were usually filled with the sounds of wind through mesquite branches and the distant calls of coyotes, but Morrison's ranch felt unnaturally quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The house showed obvious signs of vacancy. Windows were boarded up with plywood, and the front door hung at an odd angle, its lock broken and its frame warped by years of desert weather. Weeds had grown up through cracks in the concrete walkway, and the remnants of a dead garden were barely visible beside the front porch. "Let's check the workshop first," Castellanos suggested, leading the way toward the largest outbuilding. If Morrison was planning something involving vehicles, that's where he would have done the preparation. The workshop was a substantial metal building roughly 40 feet by 60 feet, with a roll-up door that had been left partially open. As they approached, Michael caught the scent of old motor oil and rusty metal, familiar smells from his father's workspace. But underneath those familiar odors was something else, something organic and unpleasant that made his stomach clench. Castellanos drew his flashlight and pushed the workshop door open wider. The interior was cast in deep shadows, illuminated only by shafts of sunlight filtering through gaps in the metal siding. As their eyes adjusted, they could make out the shape of automotive equipment, a hydraulic lift, tool benches, and scattered parts that suggested Morrison had been more than just a casual mechanic. "Professional setup," Castellanos noted, sweeping his flashlight across the workshop. "This is where he would have brought your father's truck for those phantom repairs." Michael followed the detective deeper into the building, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. Along the back wall, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Chains mounted to heavy metal brackets, positioned at heights that would accommodate both adults and children. "Detective," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. Castellanos approached and examined the chains, his expression growing grim. The metal showed signs of use, with scratches and wear patterns that suggested they'd restrained struggling occupants. Nearby, Michael noticed dark stains on the concrete floor that could have been old motor oil, but somehow seemed more sinister. In this context, "This is where he brought them," Michael said, the words coming out like broken glass. "After the camping trip, after he took them from Canyon de Chelly, he brought them here." Castellanos was already on his radio, calling for backup and a crime scene team. The workshop had transformed from an abandoned building into potential evidence in a 15-year-old kidnapping case. As they waited for additional units to arrive, the detective continued examining the space with professional attention to detail. "There's something else," he said, kneeling beside what appeared to be a trap door in the concrete floor. The metal handle was rusty but functional, and when Castellanos pulled it open, the smell that emerged was overwhelmingly foul, the scent of decay and neglect that had been fermenting in darkness for years. Michael approached reluctantly, dreading what they might find in the space below. Castellanos descended first, his flashlight beam revealing a crude basement or storm cellar carved out of the desert hardpan. The space was perhaps 8 feet by 12 feet, with walls of rough concrete and a dirt floor that showed signs of recent disturbance. "Jesus Christ," Castellanos breathed, his light playing across the cellar's contents. The basement had been set up as a prison. Sleeping bags were arranged along one wall, and Michael could see the remnants of what might have been a makeshift toilet in one corner. Food containers and water jugs were scattered throughout the space, some still containing unidentifiable contents that had long since spoiled. But most disturbing were the personal items, clothing that looked like it could have belonged to his family, books that might have been Sophia's, and small comfort objects that spoke of long-term imprisonment. "They were alive," Michael said, his voice breaking. "They were kept here in this hole for who knows how long." Castellanos climbed back up to the workshop level, his face pale despite his years of experience with crime scenes. "We need to get a forensics team out here immediately. This entire property is a crime scene now." As backup units began arriving, their red and blue lights painting the desert landscape in emergency colors, Michael found himself staring at the trapdoor that had concealed his family's prison. 15 years ago, while he'd been attending high school and trying to build a normal life, his parents and sister had been trapped in that underground hell, probably hoping every day that someone would find them. "Are there remains?" he asked. Castellanos quietly. "We'll know more after the forensics team processes the scene. But Michael, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that your family didn't survive their captivity. The condition of that cellar suggests they were held for an extended period, but there's no indication they ever left." Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived as the sun was setting, his weathered face grim as Castellanos briefed him on their discoveries. Bradley had been a deputy when the Torres family disappeared, and the case had haunted him throughout his career. Seeing the evidence of their imprisonment at Morrison's ranch hit him like a physical blow. "Son of a bitch," Bradley muttered, staring at the workshop. "All these years, they were right here. 23 miles from town, and we never thought to check Morrison's property thoroughly. We had no reason to suspect him at the time," Castellanos replied. "His truck checks out as matching the description from the photographs, and his behavior at the auto shop was suspicious, but that wasn't enough for a warrant." "So it would have been if we'd connected the dots," Bradley said bitterly. "A customer who disappeared right after the Torres family vanished. We should have been all over this place." As crime scene technicians began processing the workshop and cellar, Michael walked back toward the abandoned house, needing space to process what they'd discovered. The reality of his family's fate was beginning to sink in, and the weight of 15 years of hope was transforming into grief so profound it threatened to overwhelm him. His phone buzzed with a text message, and he glanced at it absently. The number was unfamiliar, but the message made his blood freeze. "Stop digging into things that don't concern you. Some secrets are better left buried." Michael stared at the screen, his hands trembling. Someone was watching their investigation. Someone who didn't want the truth about Morrison's ranch to come to light. The question was whether that someone was Morrison himself, or if there had been others involved in his family's disappearance. Either way, Michael realized he was no longer just investigating a cold case. He was walking into active danger, and whoever had sent that message was prepared to do whatever it took to keep the truth buried in the desert sand. The anonymous text message haunted Michael through a sleepless night, its words echoing in his mind as he stared at the ceiling of his small apartment on Cedar Street. By dawn, he'd made a decision that would have terrified the 13-year-old boy who'd lost his family, but felt inevitable to the man he'd become. He was going to find Carl Morrison, no matter the cost. Detective Castellanos met him at the sheriff's department at 7 a.m., both men fueled by coffee and determination. The crime scene team had worked through the night at Morrison's ranch, processing evidence that would take weeks to fully analyze. But already, preliminary findings were painting a horrific picture of what had happened to the Torres family. DNA. Samples from the cellar confirmed the presence of all 3 family members, Castellanos reported, his voice carefully professional. Your parents and Sophia were definitely held at that location for an extended period. We also found fragments of the clothing they were wearing when they disappeared. Michael gripped his coffee cup tighter, using the physical sensation to anchor himself against the wave of grief and rage that threatened to overwhelm him. How long were they kept there? Based on the evidence, possibly months. There are indicators of attempts to make the space more livable over time. Additional bedding, books, personal comfort items. Whoever held them wasn't planning a quick resolution. You mean Morrison wasn't planning to kill them right away? Castellanos nodded grimly. The setup suggests long-term captivity. The question is why? What did Morrison want from your family that required keeping them alive? Michael pulled out his phone and showed Castellanos the threatening text message. The detective's expression darkened as he read the words, then immediately began making calls to trace the number. Within minutes, he had disappointing news. Prepaid. Burner phone, purchased with cash at a convenience store in Flagstaff. No way to trace it back to the buyer. Castellanos studied Michael's face carefully. This changes things. Someone is actively trying to discourage our investigation, which means we're getting close to something important. Or Morrison is still alive and watching us. That's one possibility. The other is that Morrison had help, accomplices who are still in the area and worried about being exposed. Sheriff Bradley joined them in the conference room, carrying a thick file folder and wearing the expression of a man who'd uncovered information he wished he hadn't found. At 62, Bradley had seen enough corruption and evil in his career to develop a sixth sense for complicated cases, and his instincts were screaming warnings about the Torres investigation. We ran Morrison's background through federal databases, Bradley said, spreading documents across the table. What we found is disturbing. Carl Morrison wasn't his real name. Michael felt the world shift beneath him. What do you mean? His real name was Carl Brennan Morrison, and he had a criminal history dating back to the 1980s. Convicted in California for kidnapping and sexual assault, served 12 years in state prison before being released in 1998. He changed his name legally and moved to Arizona to start fresh. The implications hit Michael like a physical blow. Morrison hadn't been some random, disturbed individual who'd fixated on his family. He'd been a predator with a documented history of violent crime, someone who'd specifically chosen the Torres family as victims. Why wasn't this discovered during the original investigation? Michael asked. Because we never had reason to run a deep background check on Morrison, Bradley admitted. He was just a customer at the auto shop, not a suspect. And he'd done a good job creating a new identity here in Copper Ridge. Clean credit history, steady employment as a ranch hand, no local criminal record. Castellanos spread out Morrison's California criminal file, and Michael forced himself to read the details, despite the nausea building in his stomach. Morrison had been convicted of kidnapping a young family from a camping area near Lake Tahoe, holding them captive for 3 months before releasing them and disappearing. The pattern was identical to what had happened to the Torres family, down to the outdoor abduction location and extended imprisonment. He was a serial offender, Michael said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. My family wasn't his first victims. Probably not his last either, Bradley added grimly. We've reached out to law enforcement agencies across the Southwest, checking for similar disappearances that might be connected to Morrison. So far, we've found at least 3 other cases that match the pattern. Michael studied the map Bradley had prepared, showing the locations where families had disappeared under circumstances similar to his family's case. The incidents were spread across Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada, all involving families with young children who'd vanished from camping areas or remote locations. He moved around, Castellanos observed, never stayed in one area long enough to establish a clear pattern. Your family might have been his final victims before he disappeared. Completely. Or before he was stopped, Michael said, voicing the possibility they'd all been considering. Someone could have killed him after finding out what he'd done. The meeting was interrupted by Detective Sarah Valdez from the crime scene unit, who entered carrying several evidence bags. At 34, Valdez had developed a reputation as one of the state's best forensic investigators, someone who could find meaning in the smallest traces of evidence. "We found something interesting in Morrison's workshop," she announced, setting the bags on the table. "Hidden compartment in one of the tool benches behind a false back panel." The first evidence bag contained what appeared to be identification, documents, driver's licenses, social security cards, and birth certificates belonging to multiple individuals. Some of the names were familiar from the missing persons cases Bradley had identified, confirming that Morrison had been responsible for far more than just the Torres family's disappearance. "Trophies," Valdez explained. "He kept documentation from all his victims, probably as souvenirs of his crimes." The second bag contained photographs, and Michael's blood ran cold as he recognized images of his own family among the collection. There were surveillance photos taken outside their house, at Sophia's school, at the grocery store where his mother shopped. Morrison had been watching them for weeks, possibly months, before making his move. "This is evidence of premeditation and stalking," Castellanos said, documenting each photograph carefully. "Morrison didn't choose your family randomly. He selected them specifically and planned their abduction meticulously." But it was the third evidence bag that provided the most crucial information. Inside was a detailed journal, written in Morrison's careful handwriting, documenting his surveillance activities and future plans. Michael forced himself to read passages that described his family's daily routines, their camping preparations, and Morrison's strategies for separating them from their normal environment. The final entries were the most disturbing, dated just days before the Torres family's disappearance. Morrison had written extensively about his plans for what he called the New Family Project, describing his intention to keep his victims indefinitely and force them to assume new roles in his twisted fantasy. He was completely delusional, Valdez observed. The journal entries suggest he believed he was rescuing families from inadequate lives and giving them better purposes. Michael closed the journal, unable to read any more of Morrison's sick rationalizations. The man who'd destroyed his family hadn't been a random criminal acting on impulse. He'd been a sophisticated predator who'd planned every detail of their kidnapping and imprisonment, someone who'd likely murdered other families before targeting the Torres clan. "Where is he now?" Michael asked. If Morrison was using false identities and moving frequently, he could be anywhere. "That's what we need to find out," Bradley replied. "But we have more evidence now than we've ever had before. Morrison's journal, his collection of victim identities, and the physical evidence from his ranch. We're going to find him, Michael, and when we do, he's going to answer for what he did to your family and all the others." As the meeting concluded, Michael felt a mixture of hope and dread. They were closer to finding the truth than ever before, but that truth was more horrible than he'd ever imagined. His family hadn't simply disappeared in the desert. They'd been systematically hunted, captured, and imprisoned by a monster who'd made their suffering his life's work. The threatening text message suddenly made more sense. Morrison might still be alive, watching their investigation from the shadows, prepared to kill again to protect his secrets. Or his accomplices were trying to cover their tracks before the investigation exposed them as well. Either way, Michael realized he was no longer just seeking answers about his family's fate. He was hunting a predator who'd spent decades perfecting his methods of destroying innocent lives, and that predator now knew Michael was coming for him. The Flagstaff Public Library's genealogy section buzzed with quiet activity as Michael spent his third consecutive day researching Carl Morrison's complex web of false identities. Detective Castellanos had provided him with the aliases discovered in Morrison's hidden compartment, and Michael was methodically tracking each name through public records, hoping to find clues about where the predator might have gone after abandoning his Copper Ridge Ranch. "Any luck?" asked Linda Patterson, the library's reference librarian who'd been helping Michael navigate genealogy databases and newspaper archives. At 57, Linda had assisted countless individuals researching family histories, but Michael's search for a serial kidnapper was unlike anything she'd encountered. "Maybe," Michael replied, pointing to an entry he'd found in a Nevada DMV database. Carl Brennan Morrison obtained a driver's license in Las Vegas in September 2008, just weeks after my family disappeared. The address listed is for an apartment complex that was demolished in 2015. Linda studied the screen over his shoulder. "That's progress. What about employment records or utility connections for that address?" Michael had already thought of that, but Morrison seemed to have vanished from Las Vegas as completely as he disappeared from Copper Ridge. No employment history, no credit applications, no trace of the man who'd systematically destroyed multiple families across the American Southwest. His phone buzzed with another anonymous text message, the fourth he'd received since beginning his investigation. "Your family is at peace. Don't disturb their rest." This message was different from the previous threats, carrying an almost sympathetic tone that disturbed Michael more than direct intimidation. Someone was monitoring his research activities, someone who claimed knowledge about his family's fate. The question was whether that someone was Morrison himself or an accomplice who'd been involved in the kidnappings. "Mr. Torres," Linda's voice cut through his troubled thoughts, "I found something you should see." She'd been conducting her own search using the library's subscription databases, focusing on newspaper archives from cities where Morrison's other victims had disappeared. On her screen was an article from the Albuquerque Journal, dated March 15, 2010, with a headline that made Michael's blood run cold. "Local ranch worker dies in industrial accident." The article described the death of Carl Morrison, identified as a 47-year-old employee at the Sandia Mountain Guest Ranch outside Albuquerque. According to the report, Morrison had been crushed by heavy equipment while working alone in a remote section of the property. His death had been ruled accidental, and he'd been buried in Albuquerque's Fairview Memorial Park 3 days later. "If this is accurate, Morrison died less than 2 years after your family disappeared," Linda observed. "But that doesn't necessarily mean your family died with him." Michael stared at the article, his mind racing with implications. If Morrison had died in 2010, then someone else had been sending the threatening text messages. Someone who knew about Morrison's crimes and was trying to prevent Michael from uncovering the full truth about what had happened. "I need to call Detective Castellanos," Michael said, pulling out his phone. The detective answered on the first ring, and Michael quickly briefed him on the discovery of Morrison's apparent death. Castellanos listened intently, asking specific questions about the newspaper report and the circumstances of the accident. "We'll need to verify this independently," Castellanos said. "Death records, autopsy reports, confirmation from the Albuquerque Police Department. If Morrison really died in 2010, it changes our entire investigation." "But not necessarily in a good way," Michael replied. "If Morrison is dead, then who's been sending me threatening messages? And what happened to my family between 2008 and 2010? Those are the questions we need to answer. Can you fax me that newspaper article? I'll start making calls to New Mexico authorities." After ending the call, Michael continued his research with renewed urgency. If Morrison had indeed died in Albuquerque, there might be records of his activities during the final 2 years of his life. Employment records from the guest ranch, apartment rental agreements, anything that might provide clues about what had happened to his captives. The Sandia Mountain Guest Ranch had its own website, advertising horseback riding, hiking trails, and authentic southwestern experiences for tourists seeking to escape urban life. Michael studied photographs of the property, noting the vast acreage and remote location that would have provided perfect cover for Morrison's criminal activities. His phone rang, displaying Detective Castellanos' number. "I've got confirmation from Albuquerque PD," Castellanos said without preamble. "Carl Morrison died on March 12, 2010, exactly as reported in the newspaper, crushed by a tractor that apparently slipped off its jack while he was working underneath. Death was ruled accidental, No suspicious circumstances noted. Was there any mention of family members or associates at his funeral? That's the interesting part. Only 3 people attended Morrison's burial: the ranch foreman who'd hired him, a local minister who performed generic services for indigent deaths, and an unidentified woman who signed the funeral home registry as Sarah M. No address or relationship to the deceased listed. Michael felt his pulse quicken. Sarah M. could be someone who knew about Morrison's crimes, maybe an accomplice or someone who was helping him with his victims. That's what I'm thinking. I've got the Albuquerque detectives pulling the complete file on Morrison's death, including any personal effects found at his residence. If your family was still alive when Morrison died, there might be evidence of their location. And if they weren't, Castellanos paused before answering. Then Sarah M. might know where Morrison disposed of their remains. Either way, she's our best lead for finding answers. After ending the call, Michael returned to his research with grim determination. The mysterious Sarah M. had attended Morrison's funeral, suggesting some kind of personal connection to the predator. She might have been a girlfriend, a relative, or possibly another criminal who'd worked with Morrison. Finding her identity was now the key to solving his family's disappearance. Linda Patterson approached his table with a sympathetic expression. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. If you're looking for someone who attended a funeral in Albuquerque, I might be able to help." "How?" "Funeral homes keep detailed records, including guest registries and sometimes photographs of services. If the funeral home is still in business, they might have additional information about this Sarah M. person." Michael felt a surge of hope. It was a long shot, but funeral home records might provide the break they needed to identify Morrison's mysterious mourner. Within minutes, he'd located the Chapel of Memories funeral home online and was speaking with their records department. "We do maintain historical records," the funeral director explained, "but accessing information about specific services requires proper authorization, usually from law enforcement or immediate family members." "This involves an active criminal investigation," Michael said. "Detective Ray Castellanos from the Copper Ridge Sheriff's Department can provide official authorization. Have him contact us directly. If the request is legitimate, we'll be happy to cooperate." As Michael prepared to leave the library, his phone buzzed with another anonymous message. "Sarah remembers your family fondly. They were happier in their final days than you might think." The message confirmed what Michael had suspected. Whoever was sending these texts knew Sarah M. personally, possibly was Sarah M. herself. But the reference to his family's final days suggested they were indeed dead. Information that cut through him like a knife, despite being the conclusion he'd been dreading for 15 years. Driving back toward Copper Ridge, Michael found himself thinking about the woman who'd attended Morrison's funeral. Sarah M. had cared enough about Morrison to witness his burial, suggesting a relationship that went beyond casual acquaintance. She might have been the only person who truly knew what Morrison had done with his victims, making her either the key to finding peace or the guardian of secrets too terrible to imagine. The setting sun painted the desert in shades of red and gold as Michael's truck ate up the miles between Flagstaff and home. Somewhere in this vast landscape, the truth about his family's fate was waiting to be discovered, and Sarah M., whoever she was, held the key to finally bringing the Torres family home. The Chapel of Memories funeral home sat on Albuquerque's Central Avenue like a monument to grief, its Spanish colonial architecture and carefully maintained grounds offering comfort to families navigating their darkest hours. Detective Castellanos had driven down from Copper Ridge to personally request Morrison's funeral records, bringing Michael along as the family representative needed to access information about potential victims. Director Maria Santos met them. In her office, a woman in her 60s whose gentle demeanor had comforted thousands of mourners over her 30-year career. The file she produced was disappointingly thin, containing only basic information about Morrison's burial and the 3 individuals who'd attended his service. "Such a sad case," Santos observed, reviewing the documents. "Mr. Morrison had no family, contacts in our files, no advance planning, nothing to suggest anyone cared about his passing. The woman who paid for his service said she was a friend from work. Sarah M., Castellanos noted, studying the funeral registry. Did she provide any additional information about her relationship to the deceased? Nothing formal, but I remember her because she seemed genuinely distraught. Not the typical grief of losing a family member, but something deeper, like she was mourning more than just Mr. Morrison's death. Michael leaned forward intently. Did she say anything specific about Morrison or their relationship? Santos consulted her notes from that day. She mentioned that Mr. Morrison had been helping care for her family members, that his death would leave them in a difficult situation. I offered to connect her with social services, thinking she might need assistance with elderly relatives or disabled family members. What was her response? She declined rather quickly, said the family preferred privacy, but she did ask about cemetery policies regarding additional burials in the same plot. Castellanos and Michael exchanged glances. The implications were chilling. Sarah M. had been inquiring about burying additional people near Morrison's grave, possibly planning to inter his victims in the same location. Did you get contact information for this woman? She paid in cash and provided only the name Sarah Martinez. No address or phone number, but we do have security camera footage from that day, if that would be helpful. Within minutes, Santos had located the relevant footage from March 15, 2010. The cameras had captured clear images of the 3 funeral attendees, including a woman in her 30s with shoulder-length dark hair and a distinctive scar across her left cheek. She appeared nervous throughout the service, frequently checking her surroundings as if worried about being observed. That's her, Santos confirmed. Sarah Martinez, though I suspected even then that might not be her real name. Michael studied the woman's face, memorizing her features. Sarah Martinez looked ordinary enough to blend into any crowd, but her nervous behavior and interest in additional burials suggested she'd been deeply involved in Morrison's criminal activities. Has anyone else inquired about Morrison's burial or requested access to his grave? Castellanos asked. Actually, yes. About 5 years ago, someone called asking about purchasing the plot adjacent to Mr. Morrison's. They said they were family members planning ahead, but something about the conversation felt strange. Strange how? They knew details about the burial that weren't public information. The type of casket, the time of service, even the flowers that had been placed on the grave. Like they'd been present, but wanted to pretend they hadn't been. Michael felt his pulse quicken. Did they follow through with purchasing the adjacent plot? No, they never called back, but cemetery records show that someone has been maintaining Morrison's grave regularly. Fresh flowers appear monthly, the headstone is kept clean, and the grass is trimmed more carefully than our regular maintenance would account for. This was the break they'd been hoping for. Someone was still visiting Morrison's grave, someone who cared enough about the predator to tend his burial site with religious dedication. If they could identify this person, they might finally find Sarah Martinez and learn what had happened to the Torres family. We need to set up surveillance on Morrison's grave, Castellanos said. If someone's been visiting monthly for 13 years, they're likely to continue the pattern. Santos provided them with detailed maps of Fairview Memorial Park and Morrison's exact plot location. The cemetery was large enough to provide multiple surveillance positions while remaining concealed from anyone visiting the grave. If Sarah Martinez or her associates were still alive and active, this might be their opportunity to finally confront them. As they prepared to leave the funeral home, Santos offered one final piece of information. There was something else about the woman who paid for Morrison's burial. She had a child with her that day, a little girl maybe 8 or 9 years old. The child seemed scared, kept close to the woman throughout the service. Michael's blood turned to ice. Can you describe the child? Pretty little thing, dark hair in pigtails, wearing a yellow dress. She looked upset. Not the normal sadness of a funeral, but genuine fear. I remember thinking it was odd to bring such a young child to a service for someone who wasn't family. Did the child say anything? Just once. She tugged on the woman's arm and whispered something about wanting to go home. The woman shushed her immediately and told her to be quiet. Michael found himself shaking as the implications sank in. Sarah Martinez had brought a child to Morrison's funeral, a little girl, who'd been afraid and wanted to go home. The timing was wrong for Sophia, who would have been 23 by 2010. but it suggested Morrison and his accomplices had continued taking children even after the Torres family's disappearance. "We need to check missing persons reports from around that time," he told Castellanos. "If Morrison and Sarah Martinez were still active in 2010, there might be other families who never got answers." Driving back toward Copper Ridge that evening, Michael found himself thinking about the frightened child at Morrison's funeral. Somewhere in America, parents were still wondering what had happened to their daughter, just as he'd wondered about his family for 15 years. The scope of Morrison's crimes was larger than anyone had imagined, and Sarah Martinez might be the only person alive who knew the full extent of the damage. His phone buzzed with another anonymous message. "The cemetery remembers all its children. Some secrets bloom like flowers on graves." This time the message felt different, less threatening and more like a clue. Someone was directing his attention toward Morrison's grave, possibly the same person who'd been maintaining it for over a decade. Sarah Martinez might be ready to reveal what she knew, but whether that revelation would bring closure or deeper horror remained to be seen. The desert highway stretched ahead through the darkness, carrying Michael toward answers he'd spent half his lifetime seeking. But with each new discovery, the truth seemed to grow more complex and more terrible, suggesting his family's disappearance was just one chapter in a story of evil that might have no end. Fairview Memorial Park spread across 47 acres. Of Albuquerque's northeast side, its rolling hills and mature cottonwood trees providing a peaceful final resting place for thousands of New Mexican families. At dawn on Thursday morning, Detective Castellanos and Michael positioned themselves behind a maintenance building with clear sight lines to Morrison's grave, both men equipped with binoculars and digital cameras for what might be a lengthy surveillance operation. Morrison's headstone was simple granite with basic information. Carl Morrison, 1962-2010, rest in peace. But surrounding the grave were clear signs of regular maintenance that went beyond cemetery standards. Fresh white roses had been placed beside the headstone, and the grass was trimmed with precision that suggested personal care rather than groundskeeping. Equipment. "Someone was here recently," Castellanos observed, adjusting his binoculars. "Those roses can't be more than a day or two old." Michael studied the grave through his own lenses, noting details that might provide clues about Morrison's mysterious caretaker. A small American flag had been placed at the head of the grave, and wind chimes hung from a nearby tree branch, their soft melody audible across the cemetery grounds. "The decorations suggest someone who knew Morrison personally," Michael said, "not just a hired service maintaining the grave." Their vigil was interrupted by the arrival of a silver Honda Civic, moving slowly along the cemetery's main road, as if the driver was looking for a specific location. Michael and Castellanos crouched lower behind the maintenance building, watching. As the vehicle parked near Morrison's section and a woman stepped out, even at distance they could see she matched the description from the funeral home security footage. Medium height, shoulder-length dark hair, and a distinctive scar across her left cheek. She carried a small bouquet of flowers and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd made this journey many times before. "That's her," Michael whispered. "That's Sarah Martinez." The woman approached Morrison's grave with obvious familiarity, replacing the previous flowers with fresh ones and spending several minutes arranging them carefully. She knelt beside the headstone and appeared to be speaking, though her words were inaudible from their surveillance position. "She's talking to him," Castellanos noted. "This isn't just grave maintenance. She's having a conversation with Morrison." After 15 minutes of what appeared to be one-sided dialogue, Sarah Martinez stood and walked toward a different section of the cemetery. Michael and Castellanos followed at a distance, using headstones and landscaping for cover as they tracked her movements through the memorial park. She stopped at another grave, this one marked with a simple stone bearing only dates, 2008-2010. No name, no epitaph, just the years that corresponded exactly with the period between the Torres family's disappearance and Morrison's death. "Jesus Christ," Michael breathed, understanding hitting him like a physical blow. "That's where they are. That's where she buried my family." Sarah Martinez knelt beside the unmarked grave and began placing flowers, her movements reverent and careful. She remained there for nearly 20 minutes, occasionally touching the headstone and speaking in whispers that carried no further than the surrounding monuments. Castellanos was already on his radio, calling for backup and requesting immediate assistance from Albuquerque police. They needed to approach Sarah Martinez carefully. She was their only link to Morrison's victims, and any misstep could result in losing the answers they'd spent 15 years seeking. "Move slowly," Castellanos instructed as they began approaching her position. "We don't want to spook her into running or doing something desperate." They were within 30 yards when Sarah Martinez sensed their presence. She looked up from the grave with startled eyes, her hand instinctively reaching into her purse. For a moment, Michael thought she might be armed, but instead she pulled out a cell phone and began typing rapidly. "Police officers," Castellanos called out, displaying his badge. "We'd like to speak with you about Carl Morrison." Sarah Martinez stood slowly, her face showing resignation rather than surprise. Up close, Michael could see she was older than she'd appeared in the funeral home footage, probably in her mid-40s now, with lines of stress etched around her eyes. The scar on her cheek was more prominent than he'd expected, suggesting it had been caused by significant trauma. "I've been expecting you," she said, her voice carrying a slight Southwest accent. "I wondered how long it would take someone to trace Morrison's victims to their final resting place." Michael stepped forward, his hands trembling with 15 years of suppressed emotion. "Are they here? Is this where you buried my family?" Sarah Martinez looked at him with an expression that mixed sympathy and profound sadness. "Your family," she repeated softly. "The Torres family from Copper Ridge, Elena, David, and little Sophia. You know their names." "I know all their names. I was there, Mr. Torres. I was with them during their final months." The admission hit Michael like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears while simultaneously providing the first concrete answers he'd received in 15 years. Sarah Martinez hadn't just known about Morrison's crimes. She'd been an active participant, present during his family's captivity and death. "Why?" Michael asked, his voice breaking. "Why did Morrison take them? What did you do to them?" "It's complicated," Sarah Martinez replied, glancing nervously at the approaching police sirens. "Morrison wasn't the monster you think he was. He was sick, yes, and his methods were wrong, but he genuinely believed he was saving families from inadequate lives. By kidnapping and imprisoning them, by giving them purpose they'd never had before. Your family became part of something larger, Mr. Torres. They found meaning in their final months that they'd never experienced in their ordinary lives." Detective Castellanos moved closer, his hand resting on his service weapon. "Sarah Martinez, you're under arrest for conspiracy in the kidnapping and murder of the Torres family. You have the right to remain silent." "I waive my rights," she interrupted. "I've been waiting 13 years to tell this story. The families deserve to know what really happened to them." As backup units arrived and crime scene investigators began establishing a perimeter around the unmarked grave, Sarah Martinez began talking. Her story was more horrific than Michael had imagined, involving not just the Torres family, but dozens of other victims who'd been systematically kidnapped, imprisoned, and ultimately murdered by Morrison and his network of accomplices. Morrison called it the Family Project, she explained as they walked toward the police vehicles. He believed traditional families were weak and unfulfilled, that he could create better family units through forced cooperation and shared hardship. "You mean through kidnapping and torture?" "I mean through purpose and belonging that most people never experience. Your family learned to depend on each other in ways they never had before. They became closer, more connected than they'd ever been in their normal lives." Michael wanted to strike her, to make her understand the magnitude of evil she was describing, as if it were some kind of therapeutic intervention. But he also needed answers, information that only Sarah Martinez could provide about his family's final months and the location of their remains. "How did they die?" he asked, the words cutting his throat like broken glass. Sarah Martinez looked at him with what seemed like genuine compassion. "Peacefully, Mr. Torres. When Morrison died, they were released from their earthly suffering. They died together as a family, which is what Morrison always intended. You murdered them. I helped them transition to a better existence. Your family is at peace now, united forever in ways that mundane life never allows. As Sarah Martinez was loaded into a police vehicle, still talking about Morrison's twisted philosophy and the fate of his victims, Michael stared at the unmarked grave that might contain his family's remains. After 15 years of wondering, he was finally going to learn the truth about what had happened to the people he loved most. But the truth he was beginning to understand was going to be far more horrible than any nightmare he'd imagined during his years of searching. Morrison and Sarah Martinez hadn't just murdered his family, they'd convinced themselves they were providing a service, saving people from lives they deemed inadequate through kidnapping, imprisonment, and ultimately death. The excavation of the unmarked grave at Fairview Memorial Park began at dawn on Friday morning, with forensic anthropologists from the University of New Mexico working alongside Albuquerque police investigators and FBI agents who joined the case due to its interstate nature. Michael stood behind crime scene tape, watching strangers carefully unearth what might be his family's final resting place 15 years after their disappearance. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the lead forensic anthropologist, approached the grave with scientific precision that seemed almost reverent in the cemetery setting. At 42, she'd worked dozens of similar excavations, but the potential scope of Morrison's crimes made this case particularly significant for law enforcement agencies across the Southwest. "We're proceeding carefully," Dr. Chen explained, to Michael and Detective Castellanos. "Sarah Martinez's statements suggest multiple victims might be buried in this location, so we need to document everything meticulously." Sarah Martinez had spent her first night in custody providing detailed confessions to FBI agents, describing Morrison's family project and the fate of his victims with a matter-of-fact tone that disturbed even experienced interrogators. According to her account, Morrison had kidnapped over 30 people across 4 states, holding them in various locations before ultimately murdering them when his psychological experiments were complete. The Torres family was special to Morrison, Agent Patricia Reeves had reported after the initial interrogation. Martinez claims they were held for nearly 2 years, longer than any of his other victims. Morrison apparently believed they represented his most successful family unit. Michael tried to process the information objectively, but the clinical language couldn't diminish the horror of what his family had endured. 2 years of captivity under Morrison's control, subjected to whatever twisted psychological manipulation he'd considered therapeutic. The 13-year-old boy who'd broken his leg and missed the camping trip had been spared a fate worse than death. "First remains coming up," Dr. Chen announced, carefully exposing what appeared to be human skeletal material at a depth of approximately 4 feet. Adult female, based on preliminary examination. Michael's legs nearly gave out. After 15 years of hoping and searching, he was finally looking at physical evidence of his family's fate. The bones were arranged naturally, suggesting the body had been buried with care rather than simply dumped, though that small mercy provided little comfort. "There are others," Dr. Chen continued, expanding the excavation area. "At least 2 more. Sets of remains, possibly 3. They appear to have been buried together side by side." Detective Castellanos moved closer to Michael, providing silent support as the excavation continued. They'd worked this case together for 15 years, and Castellanos understood the emotional weight of finally finding answers, even answers as terrible as these. "Sarah Martinez wants to speak with you," he said quietly. "She's requesting a meeting before she's transferred to federal custody." "Why?" "She claims she has information about your family that she'll only share with you personally, messages they wanted passed along, things Morrison didn't know about their time in captivity." Michael stared at the excavation site, watching forensic experts carefully uncover his family's remains, while considering whether he could face the woman who'd participated in their murder. Part of him wanted to refuse, to let Sarah Martinez take whatever secrets she had to prison with her, but another part needed to know everything, to understand his family's final months as completely as possible. "All right," he said, "I'll talk to her." The Albuquerque Police Department's interview room was sterile and windowless, designed to make suspects uncomfortable while providing investigators with complete control over the environment. Sarah Martinez sat at a metal table, her hands cuffed to a chain around her waist, looking smaller and more fragile than she had at the cemetery. "Thank you for coming," she said, as Michael entered with Agent Reeves and Detective Castellanos. "I know this is difficult, but your family wanted you to know certain things. They're dead because of you," Michael replied, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "Don't pretend you were doing them any favors." Morrison genuinely believed he was helping people find purpose and meaning they'd never experienced in conventional life. The families who participated in the project developed bonds stronger than anything possible in normal society. "You mean the families you kidnapped and murdered?" Sarah Martinez leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest despite the insanity of her words. "Your mother became the most remarkable woman I've ever known during her time with us. She found strength and resilience that her teaching career never allowed her to develop. Your father discovered leadership abilities that working as a mechanic had never revealed. And Sophia, what did my 8-year-old sister discover while you held her? Prisoner for 2 years?" Sophia bloomed like a flower in spring. She became the heart of the family unit, bringing joy and purpose to everyone around her. Morrison said she was proof that children thrive when given clear structure and unconditional love. Michael wanted to lunge across the table and strangle Sarah Martinez, but Agent Reeves's restraining hand on his shoulder reminded him that losing control would accomplish nothing. The woman sitting across from him was completely delusional, interpreting kidnapping and murder as some kind of therapeutic intervention. "How did they die?" he asked, forcing himself to focus on facts rather than emotions. When Morrison passed away unexpectedly, the family units lost their guiding structure. Without his leadership and purpose, they couldn't maintain the psychological framework that had given their lives meaning. They chose to join him rather than return to their previous, inadequate existence. "You murdered them. I helped them transition peacefully to a higher plane of existence. Your family died together, holding hands, singing the lullaby your mother used to sing to Sophia. It was beautiful, Mr. Torres. They were at peace." Michael closed his eyes, trying to process the image Sarah Martinez was describing. His family's final moments, orchestrated by a madwoman who'd convinced herself she was providing a service. The clinical language couldn't disguise the fact that she'd murdered 3 innocent people who'd spent 2 years praying for rescue. "There's something else," Sarah Martinez continued. "Your mother asked me to tell you something specific if you ever found us." "What?" She said to tell Michael that her broken bird learned to fly. She said you'd understand what that meant. The words hit Michael like a physical blow because he did understand. When Sophia was 6, she'd found an injured sparrow in their backyard and begged their parents to help it recover. Their mother had explained that sometimes broken things could become stronger than they'd ever been before. That healing often led to abilities people never knew they possessed. "She wanted you to know that their time with Morrison hadn't broken them," Sarah Martinez explained. "They'd learned to fly higher and stronger than ever before. She was proud of who they'd become." Michael stood abruptly, unable to listen to any more of Sarah Martinez's twisted interpretations of his family's suffering. Whatever strength they'd found during their captivity had been born of necessity, not choice. They'd adapted to survive, not because they'd found some higher purpose in being kidnapped and imprisoned. "We're done here," he told Agent Reeves. "Wait." Sarah Martinez called as he headed for the door. "There's more your family wanted you to know, about why Morrison chose them specifically, about what made them special." Michael paused at the threshold, torn between needing complete answers and protecting himself from further psychological torture. After 15 years of wondering, he was finally learning the truth about his family's fate, but that truth was more horrible than anything he'd imagined. "They chose you," he said, turning back to face Sarah Martinez. "Morrison chose my family because of something specific. What was it?" Sarah Martinez smiled, the expression chilling in its apparent sincerity. "He chose them because they were already perfect. Your parents' love for each other and for their children was exactly what Morrison wanted to preserve and enhance. The Torres family became his masterpiece, the ultimate proof that the family project could work. By destroying their lives, by giving them eternal meaning, your family will be remembered forever, Mr. Torres. their love story became something immortal. Michael left the interview room with Sarah Martinez's words echoing in his mind, understanding, finally, why Morrison had targeted his family above all others. It hadn't been random selection or convenience. Morrison had specifically chosen the Torres family because their natural love and closeness represented exactly what he'd wanted to capture and control. The irony was devastating. His family had been murdered because they'd loved each other too much, their very strength and unity making them perfect victims for a predator who'd convinced himself he was preserving something beautiful rather than destroying it.